The Great Wall of China was never built to keep enemies out. That explanation, the one repeated in every textbook, every documentary, every tour guide script delivered at the Battling Gate, is a convenient story layered over a far more unsettling reality. The wall doesn't behave like a defensive structure. It doesn't follow the logic of military engineering. It follows something else entirely. A logic that becomes visible only when you stop looking at the wall as a barrier and start looking at it as a machine. Walk the ridgelines of Hebei province on a gray autumn morning, and the wall reveals itself differently than it does in photographs. The photographs flatten it. They reduce it to a scenic ribbon draped over green mountains, a postcard of ancient ambition. But standing on the actual stones that in some sections weigh up to 1 ton each, stones hauled to elevations exceeding 4,000 feet above sea level without any confirmed mechanical means, the sensation is not awe. It is unease. The wall does not feel like a construction project. It feels like something that was already there, and then someone decided to explain it. That distinction between a thing built and a thing explained is where the real investigation begins. And once you feel it standing on those stones, you cannot unfeel it looking at the maps, the measurements, the mortar analysis, the astronomical alignments that no military historian has ever satisfactorily addressed. The official narrative assigns construction of the modern wall almost entirely to the Ming Dynasty, roughly between 1368 and 1644. Before that, scattered earlier walls existed, attributed to the Qin dynasty under Emperor Qin Shi Huang around 221 BCE and to subsequent Han and Wei rulers. But here is the first fracture in the consensus story. The Ming Wall and the Qin Wall are not the same structure. They are not even in the same locations across large portions of the route. The Qin Wall, where physical evidence has been found, runs along entirely different ridgelines, through different provinces at different elevations. These are not renovations of the same project. These are separate constructions built in separate eras, and the academic habit of calling them both the Great Wall conceals a staggering discontinuity in the historical record. You cannot renovate something that no longer exists in the same place. What the Ming builders did was not restoration. It was independent construction on a different path, for reasons the official record never clearly explains. Examine the architectural language of the Ming-era wall sections, and something immediately demands explanation. The wall, in its fully developed form, is not one structure. It is a system. It consists of an outer parapet, an inner parapet, a central walkway wide enough for 5 horses to ride abreast, drainage channels cut precisely into the stone at regular intervals, and a network of watchtowers placed at intervals that ensured line-of-sight communication across the entire length. That last detail is not incidental. The towers were positioned with geometric precision so that signal fires or smoke from one tower would always be visible to the next. This is not the product of intuitive labor. This is the product of sophisticated surveying technology applied across 13,000 miles of terrain with a consistency that modern engineers have described, in peer-reviewed literature, as difficult to replicate without aerial mapping. The Ming Dynasty did not have aerial mapping. They did not have GPS. And yet the optimization exists. It is measurable. Researchers using modern satellite imaging and topographic modeling have confirmed that the watchtower network achieves near-perfect line-of-sight coverage with minimal redundancy, meaning whoever designed the system was not guessing. They were calculating. The question that official history quietly avoids is, calculating with what? With what instruments? With what knowledge base? With what underlying framework did a pre-industrial civilization achieve an optimization that strains the capabilities of modern infrastructure planning? The labor figures alone should have ended the conventional narrative decades ago. Conservative estimates place the Ming-era workforce at between 400,000 and 1 million workers at any given time over the course of the dynasty's construction campaigns. Many of these workers died during construction. Some estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of deaths, with bodies allegedly buried within the wall itself, giving rise to the oldest of the wall's myths, that it is the longest cemetery on Earth. There is archaeological evidence for this. Human skeletal remains have been found within the wall's foundations in multiple excavation sites, and some researchers have interpreted this not as accidental entombment during construction collapse, but as deliberate ritual interment. Bodies placed into the foundations as structural or spiritual anchors. The distinction matters enormously. Accidental burial is a tragedy of labor. Deliberate burial is a ritual act, and ritual acts imply purpose beyond the military. Consider the wall's relationship with water. In virtually every section where the Ming construction teams worked with original materials rather than quarried stone, meaning sections where they used the local earth, compressed into rammed earth cores and faced with brick, the walls exhibit a remarkable resistance to water infiltration that modern analysis has traced to the mortar. The binding agent used in large portions of the wall's brick construction contains sticky rice flour. This has been confirmed by laboratory analysis. Sticky rice mortar, a mixture of sticky rice soup and slaked lime, produces a calcium carbonate matrix that actually becomes harder when wet, and which resists the growth of weeds and grass through the joints. It was, by any measure, a superior material for the conditions, but it was also an extraordinary material to produce in industrial quantity for a construction project of this scale. The logistics of cooking, transporting, and mixing enough sticky rice to mortar a structure stretching thousands of miles staggers comprehension. The Ming Dynasty didn't just build a wall. They deployed an industrial adhesive technology that materials scientists would not formally understand until the 21st century, and that is the pattern. Everywhere you look at the Great Wall with precision rather than reverence, you find technological decisions that exceed their context. The drainage channels cut into the walkway's surface are angled at a consistent gradient regardless of the local terrain. They always slope outward toward the parapet edge, never inward toward the walkway's center, which means runoff is perpetually directed away from the wall's structural core. This prevents frost heave damage in the northern winters and prevents erosion of the mortared joints. This is, in contemporary civil engineering terminology, passive moisture management, and it works. Sections of the wall built with this drainage geometry have survived largely intact for over 5 centuries. Sections where later, less precise builders abandoned the gradient have collapsed or deteriorated significantly. The original builders understood something about long-term material behavior that goes well beyond intuitive craftsmanship. They were not building for a season, or a decade, or a reign. They were building for something that needed to last. The towers deserve their own examination. At Jinshanling, in Hebei Province, the watchtowers are not uniform boxes. They are complex structures with arched ceilings, multiple chambers on different levels, ventilation shafts, and in several documented cases, what appear to be acoustical chambers. Rooms whose geometry seems designed to amplify or transmit sound rather than to shelter soldiers. Why would a defensive watchtower need acoustical engineering? The standard explanation does not hold up to even basic scrutiny. A soldier listening for hoofbeats or footsteps does not need a resonant chamber. He needs an open window. Acoustically shaped stone rooms are a different technology with a different purpose, and no mainstream sinologist has produced a satisfying explanation for their presence. The chambers exist. They are measurable. They function as acoustic instruments. And they were built into structures whose official purpose was military observation, a combination that makes sense only if the military framing is incomplete. The wall's geographic behavior is equally anomalous when mapped against its supposed military function. A defensive wall should follow the most defensible terrain, the highest ridges, the steepest escarpments, the natural choke points through which an invading force would be compelled to pass. The Great Wall does this for significant portions of its route. But there are sections, particularly in the western reaches through Gansu and Shanxi provinces, where the wall descends from defensible high ground to follow river valleys, or bends to encompass zones of apparently flat, open terrain with no obvious defensive value. Military historians have noted this for generations without resolving it. The standard explanation is administrative rather than strategic, that wall sections sometimes marked tax collection points or trade route checkpoints rather than pure defense lines. But that explanation, convenient as it is, transforms the wall's character entirely. It means the wall was simultaneously a military installation, an economic instrument, and a territorial boundary marker. Three entirely different systems of control folded into a single structure. That is not a wall. That is infrastructure. Infrastructure is the more honest word for what the Great Wall actually is, and the implications of that word are enormous. Infrastructure implies a system, something that exists to enable other activities, to facilitate movement, to regulate flow. A wall is passive. Infrastructure is active. When you reclassify the Great Wall as infrastructure, its anomalies stop being anomalies and start being features. The wide walkways accommodate movement, not just observation. The watchtowers with their multiple chambers serve as communication nodes, not just guard posts. The consistent drainage engineering ensures long-term structural integrity, not for a temporary military campaign, but for permanent, continuous use. And the sticky rice mortar, the extraordinary, expensive, logistically demanding sticky rice mortar, makes sense only if the people who specified it expected the structure to last not decades, but centuries. They were not building for their war. They were building for their civilization, and possibly for something beyond their civilization. For a purpose that extended past any individual dynasty's political horizon. If you enjoy historical stories about the hidden mysteries of the past, please like this video and leave a comment with 1. If you don't, write 0. This helps us understand how valuable these narratives are to you. Here is where the deeper question enters. The Ming dynasty's stated justification for the wall was protection against the Mongol successor states in the north, the Oirat Confederation, the northern Yuan remnants, the Tatar groups who continued to raid Chinese territory throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. This is historically documented. The raids were real, the threat was real, and the wall was partly a response to it. But here is the problem. The wall didn't work. Not as a defensive barrier. The Mongols, and later the Manchu forces who founded the Qing dynasty, did not stop at the wall. They went through it, sometimes by force, often through negotiated gate opening by compromised commanders, and ultimately by sheer persistence. The Ming dynasty fell in 1644, and the wall did not save it. If the wall's primary purpose was military defense, and it failed at that purpose catastrophically, why did the dynasty pour resources into it for nearly 3 centuries? What were they actually building? One answer that has circulated in alternative research circles, and that deserves more rigorous attention than it typically receives, involves the wall's relationship to an older network of structures across the Eurasian landmass. Researchers examining aerial and satellite imagery have identified a series of earthwork systems, stone alignments, and fortified ridgelines stretching from the Korean peninsula westward through Central Asia to the Black Sea region that share certain structural characteristics with the Great Wall. Consistent watchtower spacing, similar drainage engineering approaches, and an apparent relationship to astronomical alignments. These structures span multiple cultures and multiple historical periods, and the mainstream interpretation is that they are independent developments arising from similar environmental pressures. But independent development does not explain the shared geometry. Similar environments do not produce identical tower spacing ratios unless the designers are working from the same underlying mathematical framework. The shared geometry implies a shared source, a common technical tradition that predates all of the cultures that later built within it. The astronomical dimensions of the Great Wall's design have been substantially underreported in English-language scholarship, though Chinese archaeological literature has occasionally touched on them. The wall's overall orientation across its full length describes a path that, when mapped against the night sky as seen from northern China, traces a rough approximation of the celestial equator as it would have appeared during a specific historical period. This is not a recent discovery. It was noted in passing by Jesuit missionaries who visited China in the 17th century. The Jesuits, who were accomplished astronomers, described the wall's directionality in terms that suggested to them not a political boundary, but a cosmological one. A line drawn not between two human kingdoms, but between two cosmic zones. That observation was filed away in the archives of the Society of Jesus and has not been systematically followed up in the 5 centuries since. It waits there, in the Jesuit records, an astronomical observation made by some of the most scientifically rigorous minds of the early modern period, pointing toward a dimension of the wall's design that the official historical narrative has never incorporated. Qin Shi Huang, the emperor credited with the first great unification of the wall in the 3rd century BCE, was not a man who thought in purely military or administrative terms. He was a man obsessed with immortality, with cosmic order, and with the alignment of earthly power to celestial principles. His capital at Xianyang was laid out according to astronomical correspondences. His tomb, still largely unexcavated, still surrounded by the terracotta armies discovered in 1974, is oriented with precise astronomical awareness. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have suggested that the inner burial complex contains a model of the heavens rendered in mercury, with rivers and seas mapped in liquid metal flowing across the tomb floor. A man who built his own death chamber as a cosmological instrument did not build his northern border as a simple fence. The wall that Qin Shi Huang ordered constructed was, in the logic of his civilization, a boundary between the ordered human world and the cosmic chaos beyond it. Not a military line, but a metaphysical one. This cosmological dimension of the wall's design connects to something that archaeologists excavating wall foundations in the 20th century discovered and largely set aside without explanation. The presence, in multiple foundation layers, of deliberately placed ritual deposits. These are not random inclusions. They are structured assemblages, ceramic vessels, bronze objects, animal bones, and in several cases, inscribed jade tablets placed at foundation corners before the wall was raised over them. This is foundation ritual, a practice documented across dozens of ancient cultures, from Mesopotamian temple construction to Roman city founding ceremonies. The practice of placing votive deposits in foundations is almost universally associated with structures believed to have cosmological significance. Temples, sacred enclosures, astronomical observatories. Defensive walls don't typically receive foundation rituals. Sacred architecture does. The wall received them consistently, across multiple construction periods, across multiple dynasties, across multiple centuries of builders who apparently agreed on one thing. This structure required ritual acknowledgement at its foundations. The jade tablets found in foundation deposits are especially significant. Jade in Chinese civilization is not decorative. It is cosmologically charged, a material believed to possess properties that bridge the human and divine realms, that resist decay and corruption, that carry and transmit celestial energy. The placement of inscribed jade at the foundations of the wall implies that whoever commissioned those sections understood the wall as a structure with active cosmological function, something that was meant to do something beyond its visible physical form. What that function was, the surviving inscriptions, fragmentary, partially decoded, disputed among specialists, suggest has to do with containment. Not containment of human enemies, containment of something understood to exist in the territory north of the wall. The word used in several of the tablet inscriptions translates most directly not as enemy or barbarian, but as something closer to unbound force, a term from the Taoist metaphysical vocabulary that refers to energy or presence that has not been integrated into the ordered cosmological system of the civilized world. The Northern Territories. This is where the narrative deepens in ways that official history has never been comfortable addressing. The regions beyond the wall, the Mongolian steppe, the Gobi Desert, the vast, empty interior of the Asian continent, were not simply populated by nomadic raiders in Chinese cosmological thinking. They were populated by forces. Chinese texts from the Han Dynasty onward describe the northern regions as home to entities and phenomena that do not map onto modern categories. Spiritual disturbances, uncontrolled energies, presences that the nomadic peoples themselves acknowledged and negotiated with through shamanic practice. The Xiongnu, the nomadic confederacy that was the primary threat to the Han Dynasty, were not simply warriors. Their religious and ritual leadership included shamans who performed ceremonies explicitly aimed at managing contact with what their cosmology described as forces existing at the edge of the known world. The wall, in this reading, was not built to stop the Xiongnu. It was built to stop what the Xiongnu were in contact with. This reframing does not require accepting the cosmological premise. It requires only accepting that the builders took that premise seriously enough to act on it at continental scale. This interpretation appears, in carefully coded language, in several classical Chinese texts that describe the wall not as a military fortification, but as a sealing line, a term that in its original context carries distinctly ritual connotations. The term appears in texts discussing Taoist geomantic practice, where it refers to a structure built along a fault line in the Earth's qi field, a line of energy flow, in order to redirect, contain, or seal that flow. The wall, in the geomantic literature, is described as running along a major qi fault line of the continental landmass, and its construction is framed as an act of planetary engineering rather than human architecture. Planetary engineering. The phrase sounds excessive until you examine the scale of the project objectively. The Great Wall, in its total material volume across all construction periods, represents a quantity of stone, brick, rammed earth, and mortar that modern engineering estimates place it somewhere between 100 million and 300 million cubic meters. That is more material than the Egyptian pyramids combined, significantly more by most calculations. It required an organizational system of extraordinary complexity. Quarrying operations spread across hundreds of miles, supply chains moving materials through some of the most difficult terrain in Asia. quality control mechanisms that maintained consistent construction standards across a workforce distributed over thousands of miles. The Qin dynasty accomplished a substantial portion of this in less than a decade, during a period when the empire was simultaneously fighting wars on multiple fronts, building the Grand Canal network, constructing the imperial road system, and erecting Qin Shi Huang's tomb complex. The logistical impossibility of this has been quietly noted by historians for generations. The standard response is to attribute it to the use of forced labor. Millions of conscripts, thousands of deaths. But forced labor, however abundant, does not solve the engineering and logistics problem. Desperate and unwilling workers do not spontaneously develop consistent mortar formulations, precise drainage gradients, and geometrically optimal tower placement. Someone was designing this. Someone understood the whole system simultaneously. The possibility that the Great Wall was built, in part, using a pre-existing structural framework. That Ming and Qin builders were not creating from scratch, but restoring, extending, and reinterpreting a far older network of structures, has been raised intermittently in archaeological literature and consistently dismissed without systematic refutation. The dismissal rests largely on the absence of confirmed evidence for earlier construction, which is not the same thing as confirmed absence of earlier construction. The wall sits on top of its own foundations. Excavating those foundations across its full length has not been done, and the Chinese government has not been particularly eager to facilitate it. What limited foundation excavation has occurred has produced unexpected results, including, in several documented cases, foundation stones of a different lithological character than the surrounding local geology, meaning they were transported from elsewhere, implying a construction campaign that preceded the known historical dynasties. Foundation stones transported from geological formations hundreds of miles away. That is the kind of detail that should prompt systematic investigation. It implies that whoever laid those original foundations had both the organizational capacity to move enormous quantities of stone over vast distances and the specific intention to build in exactly those locations. Those locations were later inherited by the Qin and Ming builders. The continuity of site selection across historical periods that had no direct contact with each other is one of the strongest arguments for an underlying design that preceded all of them. Something chose those ridge lines. Something calculated those tower positions. And the dynasties that came later found those positions and built on them, perhaps without fully understanding why those positions were correct, perhaps operating from inherited instructions whose original rationale had been lost, following a blueprint whose author was no longer available to explain the reasoning. Lost knowledge is the thread that runs through the entire history of the Great Wall, and it is nowhere more visible than in the wall's failed sections. When Ming engineers departed from the construction standards of the most durable sections, when they used different mortar formulations, abandoned the drainage gradient, or altered the tower spacing ratios, the results degraded rapidly. This is documented. The sections of the wall that deteriorated fastest were almost uniformly sections built by the later Ming contractors who had inherited responsibility for the project, but had lost access to the original technical specifications. They were working from memory, from approximation, from the visible surface of a technology they no longer fully understood. They could see what the wall looked like. They could not fully reconstruct why it worked. And so they built imperfect copies of a perfect original, a pattern recognizable to anyone who has studied the transmission of advanced technical knowledge across historical discontinuities. The copy preserves the form. It loses the function. And the functional loss is the fingerprint of a civilization working from inherited instructions it can no longer decode. Advanced technical knowledge across historical discontinuities. This is, in the end, what the Great Wall represents. a monument to the gap between what a civilization could build and what the historical record says it should have been capable of. The gap is enormous. It has been papered over with narratives of imperial will and mass labor for centuries. And those narratives are not entirely false. Imperial will and mass labor were certainly involved. But they are insufficient. They explain the political motivation for the wall without explaining the technical mastery embedded in it. They explain who ordered the construction without explaining who designed it. And the designer, the intelligence that optimized the tower spacing, specified the mortar formulation, calculated the drainage gradients, oriented the whole structure along a path of geomantic and possibly astronomical significance. That intelligence is absent from the official record. Not marginalized, not disputed, not debated. Absent. As if the question of who designed the Great Wall has never been considered worth formally asking. The absence is not accidental. The Qin dynasty, which consolidated the first Great Wall, also conducted one of the most systematic destructions of historical records in human history. The burning of the books in 213 BCE, which eliminated an estimated 90% of the philosophical, historical, scientific, and technical literature that had accumulated in China over the preceding centuries. The official justification was political. Qin Shi Huang wanted to erase competing historical narratives and establish his dynasty as the beginning of history itself. But what was actually destroyed in those fires went far beyond political inconvenience. Technical manuals, astronomical records, geographical surveys, architectural specifications, the accumulated technical knowledge of Chinese civilization up to that point, went into the flames. What survived was curated, controlled, and in many cases rewritten under imperial supervision. The Qin dynasty did not just build the wall, they built the story of the wall. They determined, with great deliberateness, what future generations would be allowed to know about why it was built and how. Consider what that means for every source that modern historians rely on when discussing the wall's construction and purpose. Every Chinese historical text describing the wall was written after the burning of the books, by writers working within a politically controlled literary environment, drawing on sources that had survived imperial censorship. The earliest accounts of the wall's construction are not contemporary documents. They are reconstructions, written generations after the events they describe, filtered through layers of political mediation. In many cases, they were explicitly designed to serve the ideological needs of the dynasties that commissioned them. This is not speculation. This is the standard condition of Chinese historiography for the pre-Han period, and every serious scholar of Chinese history acknowledges it. The acknowledgement, however, rarely leads to the logical conclusion that the story of the Great Wall we have inherited is not a historical account. It is a historical product, shaped, selected, and in critical places, invented. Invented in service of what? Here is where the investigation arrives, at its most uncomfortable destination. If the wall's true design purpose was ritual cosmological rather than military, if it was built to seal a geomantic fault line, to contain or redirect energies associated with the territory to its north, to function as a planetary-scale instrument rather than a human-scale fortification, then its military framing is not just an incomplete explanation. It is a deliberate misdirection. A society that built a structure for metaphysical purposes and then described it to posterity as a border wall was not confused about what it had built. It was controlling what future generations would think about what it had built. Active concealment across 2,000 years of institutional history requires institutional infrastructure, not a conspiracy of individual actors. but a systemic consensus among the custodians of official knowledge about what is appropriate to record and what is not. Chinese imperial civilization had exactly that infrastructure. The imperial historiographic tradition was not a passive recording of events. It was an active construction of official reality, managed by a professional class of state historians who understood that their function was as much regulatory as documentary. They decided what the wall was, and what they decided it was happened to be the explanation least likely to prompt uncomfortable questions about the civilization's true origins. The terracotta army that guards Qin Shi Huang's tomb, still, after 50 years of excavation, not fully understood, contains a detail that has been consistently underemphasized in popular accounts. The figures are not identical soldiers arranged in uniform rows. They are individuals, differentiated by rank, by regional origin, by physical type, and by what appears to be ritual function. Among the thousands of figures documented in the excavated pits, researchers have identified a subgroup that carries no weapons, whose positioning and gesture sets them apart from the military formations around them. Their clothing contains iconographic symbols that correspond to shamanistic practice in the northern steppe tradition, the tradition of the people the wall was supposedly built to keep out. These figures are inside the tomb. They are part of the ritual apparatus of the man who built the wall. Qin Shi Huang, the great unifier, the builder of the first consolidated wall between China and the north, incorporated the spiritual technology of the northern peoples into his own funerary complex. Whatever the wall was separating, it was not the entirely alien from the entirely familiar. The boundary was more complicated than that. The wall did not simply divide. It connected. Every major gateway in the Ming Wall, and there are hundreds, many now sealed or destroyed, was architecturally framed with cosmological symbols. The Jiayuguan Gate at the wall's western terminus, at the edge of the Gobi Desert, is decorated with imagery from both Chinese and Central Asian cosmological traditions, suggesting that whoever commissioned its design understood the gate as a point of controlled transition between two cosmic zones, rather than a simple military checkpoint. The gate's interior spaces include a chamber that has been interpreted by local tradition as a place where travelers performed ritual acknowledgement of the crossing, not asking permission of the military garrison, but acknowledging the spiritual significance of passing through the boundary between what the Chinese world called Na, inner, and the territory beyond. The beyond was not just a different culture, it was a different order of reality. And the gate was not a door in a fence, it was a membrane between states of being, engineered, consecrated, and controlled. We have been taught to see the Great Wall as a monument to Chinese civilization's greatness, its organizational power, its technological achievement. And it is certainly all of those things. But the monument to greatness narrative conceals the more disturbing truth embedded in the structure's own physical evidence. That the civilization that built the wall knew things it never formally recorded, deployed technologies it never formally documented, and pursued purposes it framed in deliberately misleading terms. The sticky rice mortar and the optimal tower geometry and the drainage engineering and the foundation rituals and the cosmological orientation are not the byproducts of a civilization building a bigger fence. They are the signature of a civilization that understood its relationship to the physical world and to forces beyond it, in ways that do not appear in any officially preserved text. Those texts were burned. The knowledge that survived was curated. The wall that was built reflects an understanding that was then systematically removed from the historical record, leaving the structure itself as the only honest document. A document written not in language, but in stone, mortar, geometry, and ritual, available to anyone willing to read it without the interpretive filter that 2 millennia of official history have placed over it. Read it that way. And what you find is not a defensive wall. What you find is a machine built by a civilization that knew more than it was willing to tell. A civilization that stood at the edge of something it took seriously enough to pour 3 centuries and hundreds of thousands of lives into containing, and that then buried the reason in burning books, sealed it in a tomb of mercury and jade, and handed the next generation a simpler story about keeping out the northern horsemen. The horsemen got through anyway. Whatever the wall was actually built to hold back has never been formally named, never been systematically investigated, and never been honestly confronted by the institutions that control the story of human history. That silence is not absence of evidence. That silence is the most deliberate structure ever built.